You are the last man in the world whom I could ever marry. Do you think that any consideration would tempt me? Your arrogance, your conceit, and your selfish disdain for the feelings of others. My opinion of you was decided when I heard Mr. Wickham's story of your dealings with him. You're mistaken, Mr. Darcy. The mode of your declaration merely spared me the concern I might have felt in refusing you, had you behaved in more gentleman-like manner. First encounters are not enough. First impressions are often wrong. This week's summary lesson will be my favorite Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice book. You will get to know the characters and join them on their journey as they realize the complexity of human nature and the many faces of truth. Now, Pride and Prejudice is a novel about the 5 daughters of the Bennet family and their quest to do what was thought of as the greatest achievement of women in Jane Austen's time, to marry off well. So I'm excited. Let's get started. Look and listen. Here we start. The main plot of the novel is driven by a particular situation of the Bennet family. If Mr. Bennet dies soon, his wife and 5 daughters will be without a home or income, as the long-born estate is entailed to one of Mr. Bennet's relatives male. Mrs. Bennet worries about this predicament and wishes to find husbands to her daughters as quickly as possible. The father, however, Mr. Bennet, doesn't seem to be worried at all. The book opens with Mr. Bingley, a wealthy young gentleman and very handsome bachelor, renting a country estate near the Bennets called Netherfield. Bingley arrives with his fashionable sisters and good friend Mr. Darcy, attending to the local assembly, the dance. Bingley is well received in the community, while Darcy begins his acquaintances with smug condescension and proud distaste for the whole country locals. Darcy was introduced to Elizabeth Bennet, but being an arrogant, he rejects the dance with her. She, however, resolves to match his coldness and Pride and Prejudice against country people with her own prideful anger, in biting wit and sometimes sarcastic remarks directed towards him. Soon Bingley and Jane begin to grow close. Jane is the big sister. Elizabeth's best friend, Charlotte, advises that Jane should show her affections to Bingley more openly, as he may not realize that she is indeed interested in him. But Elizabeth dismisses the opinion, replying that Jane is shy, modest, and if Bingley can't see how she feels, he is a complete idiot. And she doesn't tell Jane of Charlotte's warning. Meanwhile, Elizabeth meets George Wickham, a charming military officer. The two share mutual attraction, and Wickham informs her of Darcy's refusal to give him his inheritance. Elizabeth is hooked by this information, and therefore it became a good reason to dislike Darcy. Ironically enough, Darcy begins to find himself drawn to Elizabeth. Meanwhile, Mr. Collins, the male relative who is inherits to Longbourn makes an appearance and stays with the Bennets. Recently became a clergyman. He is employed as a parish rector by the wealthy and patronizing Lady Catherine de Bourgh of Court. His self-importance and pedantic, silly behavior amuses Mr. Bennet and Elizabeth, though his stated reason for visiting is to reconcile with the Bennet family. Colin soon confides to Mrs. Bennet that he wishes to find wife from among the Bennet sisters. He first offers to pursue Jane. However, Mrs. Bennet mentions that her eldest daughter is soon likely to be engaged, so she redirects him to Elizabeth's attention. At the ball given by the Bingleys at Netherfield, Elizabeth intends to deepen her acquaintances with Mr. Wickham, who, however, fails to appear. She is asked to dance by Mr. Darcy. Here she raises Wickham's faith with him, causing their harmonious dance to fall into a tasty discussion. The ball proceeds as a spectacle. The rudeness of Sir William Lucas shocks Darcy, implying that Jane and Bingley are actually an item, not to mention Mr. Collins behaves as a complete fool. Mrs. Bennet talks loudly and indiscreetly of her expectation of marriage between Jane and Bingley. And if I may say, in general speaking, it became a huge embarrassment for Jane and Elizabeth. Now, the next morning, Mr. Collins proposes marriage to Elizabeth, who refuses him, much to her mother's distress. Collins handily recovers and within 3 days proposes to Elizabeth's best friend Charlotte Lucas marriage. She immediately accepts. When Bingley suddenly leaves for London, Elizabeth's hatred for Darcy intensifies and concludes that Darcy undermining Bingley and Jane's relationship. However, Darcy is increasingly becoming attracted to Elizabeth. Eventually, Darcy proposes to Elizabeth, who declines. When Darcy demands an explanation, Elizabeth tells him that he is trying to ruin Jane and Bingley's relationship, not to mention his arrogance and bad attitudes towards other people in general. Darcy later explained himself in a letter. He writes that he doesn't believe that Jane actually loves Bingley. He also states that Wickham tried to marry his little sister Georgiana while she was 15 old after squandering his inheritance. Shortly after that, Elizabeth travels with her uncle and aunt to north of England and get to see Darcy's beautiful estate. She comes to hear good things about Darcy and his sister Georgiana from the housekeeper, who tells her that good things about them. Suddenly, to her surprise and embarrassment, who comes? Darcy appears unexpectedly. This time, he behaves kindly and generous towards Elizabeth and her uncle and aunt. Shortly after that, Lydia, the younger sister of the Bennet family, elopes with Wickham. Elizabeth's greatly alarmed, since that even could potentially ruin the reputation of all of the Bennet sisters. Upon telling Darcy the news, he secretly persuades Wickham to take Lydia's hand in marriage. He also encourages Bingley to return. Surprised Elizabeth sends an inquiry to her aunt in London, from whom she learns that Darcy himself was responsible for both finding the couple and arranging their marriage, at great expense to himself. Now Bingley returns to Longbourn and proposes marriage to Jane, who immediately accepts. Now Lady Catherine de Bourgh surprisingly visits Longbourn. She sternly tells Elizabeth she has heard rumours that Darcy proposing to her. She came with a determined resolution to confront Elizabeth and to demand that she never accept such a proposal. Well, of course, Elizabeth refuses to bow to Lady Catherine's de Bourgh demands. Darcy hears about that, and now he is convinced that Elizabeth's opinion of him has changed. He now visits Longbourn and once again proposes marriage to Elizabeth. So in the end, Bingley marries Jane and Darcy proposes to Elizabeth. Once again, this time she accepts and they two get married. The end. Thank you so much for watching Pride and Prejudice Summary Part 1. Shortly we will continue with the second part. So if you enjoy this video, please click on the like button and leave a comment. And if you are new to my channel, you are most welcome to join us to Look and Listen English Lessons. Elizabeth Bennet, an intelligent and spirited young woman who possesses a keen wit and enjoys studying people's characters. Though she initially dislikes Darcy, circumstances cause her to reassess her negative impressions of him, and she eventually falls in love with him. Fitzwilliam Darcy is a wealthy, proud man who falls in love with Elizabeth and reveals a generous, thoughtful nature beneath his somewhat stiff, cold and snobbish character. Mr. Bennet, Elizabeth's ironic and often calm and careless father. Unhappily married, he has failed to provide a secure financial future for his wife and daughters. Mrs. Bennet is Elizabeth's foolish and unrestrained mother who is obsessed with finding husbands for her daughters. Jane Bennet is a gentle and kind-hearted young woman who is Elizabeth's confidant and the oldest of the Bennet's daughters. She falls in love with Bingley but is cautious about revealing her feelings for him. Mary Bennet is a pretentious third Bennet daughter who prefers reading over socializing. Catherine Kitty Bennet, the Bennet's peevish fourth daughter, who joins her sister Lydia in flirting with soldiers. Lydia Bennet, the Bennet's immature and irresponsible youngest daughter, Mrs. Bennet's favorite, she shocks the family by running away with Wickham. Charles Bingley, a good-natured and wealthy man who falls in love with Jane. He is easily influenced by others, especially by his close friend Darcy. Caroline Bingley, Bingley's shallow and haughty sister who befriends Jane and later snubs her. She attempts to attract Darcy's attention and is jealous when Darcy is instead drawn to Elizabeth. Mr. and Mrs. Hurst, Bingley's snobbish sister and brother-in-law. Mrs. Hurst spends most of her time gossiping with Caroline, while Mr. Hurst does little more than playing cards and sleep. George Wickham, a handsome military man and personable fortune hunter to whom Elizabeth is initially attracted, he eventually runs off with Lydia and is forced to marry her by Darcy. Lady Catherine de Bourgh, Darcy's arrogant aunt who dominates Mr. Collins and entertains hopes and that her daughter will marry Darcy. Miss de Bourgh, Lady Catherine's sicky, bland daughter. Colonel Fitzwilliams, Darcy's well-mannered and pleasant cousin, is interested in Elizabeth but needs to marry someone with money. Georgiana Darcy, Darcy's shy but warm-hearted sister. Mr. Collins, Mr. Bennet's ridiculous cousin, will inherit Longbourn after Mr. Bennet's death. Upon Lady Catherine de Bourgh's recommendations, he seeks a bride, first proposing to Elizabeth and then to Charlotte Lucas. Charlotte Lucas, Elizabeth's sensible and intelligent friend, disappoints Elizabeth by marrying Mr. Collins for money and security. Sir William and Lady Lucas are Charlotte's parents and the Bennets' neighbours. Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, Mrs. Bennet's intelligent and cultivated brother and sister-in-law. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it and you found it useful. I highly recommend that you read the book and watch the series 1995 Pride and Prejudice BBC full episode series, my favorite version of all times. And I see you next time. Bye bye.